Stop. Before you put that compressor on your bass line, I actually want to show you something. You might not know what is actually happening with the tools that you use to process your kick and bass. Today I want to show you a very strange phenomena that could also be ruining your kick and bass. Let's dive right into that. So before we dive into the project, we have to look at this Discord conversation here, which might seem a little bit strange, but this was actually not a discovery made by me, this is a discovery made by MindB. Now MindB is a good friend of mine, we've made a track together and he took a lot of time out of his day to make this video possible. So if you want to support him, I'm going to leave a link to his shop down in the description below, where he has some kicks that he sells. If you're interested in presets for kick 2, then make sure to grab them. They sound nice and they're fairly cheap, so if you want to support the person who made this video possible, make sure to check them out. So MindB was working on one of his basses, and you can hear that he had a question about the processing. Now I wasn't actually able to help him with his initial problem, but from his initial messages and some experimentation, I noticed something different. What I want to do is I want to also leave a link to the Discord message right here, and then you can scroll down and you can read this whole conversation. I've done some very technical analysis with him and we came through a whole bunch of different conclusions. So if you want to see an interesting read on bass lines for psytrance, then make sure to check it out. So basically, one of the things that I had to do from the initial experimentation that we did to try to solve that first problem was to look very closely at the waveform. And this is something that I always recommend beginners to do so that they understand what a healthy waveform looks like. And in this case, with healthy, I mean a well-processed and cleaned up bassline. Most of the problems that you're going to experience with cleaning up and processing and all of that stuff is actually going to come from the bassline. Obviously, there's also some things that have to do with the kick, but the bassline is usually the main culprit of problems. So what did we find? Well, it looks like all of these waveforms look very much similar, except in terms of the volume. And what we have here is we have all of the renders from his kick and bass group. So these are the kick and bass playing together, with each time one additional plugin added. So this was his original full processing chain, and then this is one with it taking off. This is with one more plugin taken off. This is with one more plugin taken off. And this is without any of the plugins on the kick and bass group. Now I don't actually know what all of these plugins do. Maybe you do know those plugins. The first one was VLive, the second one was Rare SE. I do know what the Shadow Hills mastering compressor is, which is the third plugin in the chain. And then finally, Peak Limiter. Obviously, I don't know the plugin called Peak Limiter, but it's pretty obvious what it does. It's going to be a limiter. What I want to do now is I want to zoom in particular to this lowest waveform here, and it looks fine. If you look at it, I actually turned off the grid so it's easier to see. But if we zoom in, particularly to here, you can see that there's something weird happening to this bass waveform here. You can see something is happening, and then here, punk, it just starts going a little bit off in a random kind of direction. There's a little kink in the waveform. Now maybe you figured out by now what is going on and why this is happening, especially on this waveform here, and for example not on this waveform here. You can see there's no such kink in here. And then if we look at this one, there's going to be this kind of nasty kink in here. And this was actually causing some distortion. These are going to be slightly different in volume, but you'll be able to hear the difference between the two. And you'll be able to determine that this one sounds a lot more distorted and clipping. And the reason for that is those kinks in the waveform. And it's not just this space here either. I just zoom into this space, but if we look in here, you can see another one. If we look right here, we can see another one. And even if we start looking at the kick right here at the beginning, you will see that at the top here, you have these nasty kind of kinks in the waveform, which aren't present up top here. Now, obviously, we don't want this kind of thing, and it should be pretty obvious by now that the phenomenon that we're talking about is called limiter distortion. This is where a limiter activates on each cycle of the oscillation and deactivates in between because the level actually turns below the threshold again. So what happens is right here, the limiter detects that it needs to be turned on. It starts turning on and it starts doing its thing. There's this little kink in the waveform and then it turns off. And then right here, you can see there's another little kink in there and then it turns off and then it turns on again and then it turns off. And maybe here it doesn't seem to turn on, but then here again it does. And therefore the limiter is causing these kinks in the waveform, these little angle things, as I would call them. I don't know if kinks is the right word, but that's just how I know them to be. So does that mean that you shouldn't limit your kick and bass? Well, not really, because you should just be able to do what you want to do to a kick and bass. If your kick and bass needs limiting, you should limit it. What you should do is you should be aware of all of the side effects that those plugins have. Now, this may sound like a no-brainer, but I'm actually surprised how many people don't really know what their waveform for their kick and bass is supposed to look like in detail. People don't know that all of these problems that we're discussing now don't really translate well to big club systems or to festival speakers or even to other systems that aren't their standard listening environment. So people just kind of tend to work in a way that's whatever suits them. And that's not really how it works. There's a reason why I always hammer on checking your kick and bass with a plugin like Psyscope. And that's to catch these kind of errors, these kind of mistakes. Now, what's probably going on here is that this is not the fault of the limiter itself. It's probably configured incorrectly in the sense that it may need a little bit of extra release so that the recover time is longer than the actual oscillation and it doesn't start to distort on every cycle. So you can see if I start to add, for example, a Psyscope, it will be really easy to check for any problems. Let's just start by selecting the first one here. And we'll loop this so that it can play. And now we can zoom into whichever area that we're interested in, and we can start to look for any potential issues that there might be. So for example, here, we can look at this part of the waveform. Right now, this is silence because that's where the buffer stopped playing, but we can continue to look at the waveform and find out if there's any problems. Now, if you don't have Psyscope, even though it's free, I recommend that you actually get it. Another way to do it is just to record it into your DAW and zoom in like this, like we're doing here. And maybe this gives you a little bit more control over the way that you zoom. In this case, I do like the way that Ableton zooms a little bit more than Psyscope does. And obviously here I have the white background with the dark line, so that gives also a maximum amount of contrast and it may be easier to spot certain details. Because this is really about details, right? The final thing that I want to say is that MindB, when making his kick and bass, it's not like he did something fundamentally wrong or something like that. This is a small detail. This is the last 5% that it takes for your kick and bass to go from great to perfect. But if there's one thing that I've learned about the psytrance community is that we're always looking for better kick and basses, so I hope that this video will help improve those. Now with that, I'm going to conclude this video. If you enjoyed it and you found it helpful, make sure that you leave a like, and if you're new here and you want to see more of what I do, make sure that you're subscribed. Also, if you want to support the channel as well as obtain some products, I have a Gumroad page that you can use to support me. On there, you'll find various different products, including my masterclass. If you want to learn much more about music production, there's about 24 hours of video footage, highly edited, all explained, where I show you throughout the whole production of a whole track, including roughly 7 hours on mixing, as well as about an hour on mastering. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you check that out. I'll put a link into the description. Finally, if you want to support this channel some more, another great way of doing that is by watching another video. So I'll leave a random one in the cards at the end of this one. But that's going to be everything for now. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.